So as I've been hanging out in the Twitter sphere, since the last time we chatted, I did a couple of threads on the Joe Rogan thing, and both of those went viral. And I went from 60,000 odd followers, and I'm now sitting at like 107 or 108. Yeah. It's getting a little bit ridiculous now. And I am, as I'm going through all of this, how do I say this? I'm a bit miffed that this is the following that I've ended up with. It's a little bit strange, to be honest with you. It feels a bit surreal. So, I had to begin thinking about what it was that people liked. Why? And somebody who is a very, very high-level thinker who hangs out in the DMs sometimes and is a friend of mine, he gave me some thoughts about this, and so I'd like to riff on those just for a start.
Okay.
So I'm gonna read something I wrote, and let's see if this sticks. See if I'm right about this. See if you think I'm right. I think we've moved. So if you go way back, like way back before writing, so go back 2 or 3 or 5,000 years, it's an oral tradition and an oral culture. Things are transmitted orally. The printing press has not been invented. Writing tablets have not been invented. Papyrus has not been invented. We're basically, many societies, not all of them, maybe if you go back 30,000 years, it's all of them, are communicating orally, and things are communicated through an oral tradition. Right? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Right, okay. I just want to make sure I'm explaining that clearly. Everything is transmitted through stories. Knowledge and wisdom are passed down from one generation to another through verbal means, and people remember things. At some point, somebody figures out, hey, wait a second. We're capable of writing stuff down. We can make little notes of things. If I want to remember something, I can make a little mark on a cave wall or on a piece of leather or on a bit of wood. And at some point, somebody somewhere along the line, or maybe a group of people, or maybe it evolved slowly and bootstrapped up, figured out we could make an alphabet, and each of the little sounds that we make, we can actually just like put that down, and we can write. And at that point, we move from an oral tradition to a written tradition, where wisdom and knowledge and things that are learned are passed down via the written word. Now,
there's a good book on this called Oralacy and Literacy, I believe it is, by Walter Ong, O-N-G.
Okay. So we move into the written tradition, and once we get into the written tradition, that makes all kinds of things possible. Right? Once we get the written tradition, new kinds of math are possible, new kinds of knowledge can be transmitted. I can write a book, and I can know something very, very, very complicated and very, very, very technical. And when I die, if for some reason I'm tragically killed in an accident, my knowledge isn't just lost. What I figured out doesn't die with me. It can be passed on. And anyone who's sufficiently bright enough and sufficiently dedicated enough can read through the work of Einstein or Newton or whoever it is and can learn it. But it's more than that, because writing provides additional tools for thought. It's a lot easier when you can write something down and look it back over and over and over again to figure out whether or not it's actually valid. New kinds of math are also made possible in this way. New kinds of formal logic are made possible. It's not just that I can read something over and over again and think about whether or not that makes sense, but new forms of logic can be created. A lot of the large logical proofs from things like Well, we'll just take symbolic logic with the universal and existential quantifiers and the modal quantifiers, possibly and necessity, um, or possibly necessarily. Those sort of written algebraic notations of logic are made possible by the fact that we have writing. So we move from the oral tradition to a written tradition. Okay? So we're moving from the spoken word to the written word. Or you might say we're moving from the spoken word to the hybrid of the written and spoken word, because people are still talking to each other, and they're still reading, in many cases, out loud and explaining what's been written verbally to their students. So we have this, but it's still focused on what? Knowledge and ideas are transmitted primarily through words. So now we kind of move forward, and someone invents the video camera. And someone invents
the radio.
Yeah, the radio. We have those two things are invented, and all of a sudden, we're kind of moving back. Now the radio is a non-image, but that's a verbal thing, right? So that's still within the realm of the word. But once the video camera comes in, and everything is done with video, we begin to move to an image-based culture. People listen to the radio. They watch television. So in about the 1960s, our good friend Jacques Ellul hits on this, and he begins to discuss the humiliation of the word. The supremacy of the written word begins to crumble and fall apart. Now, we have to pause for a moment so that we can hit something that's kind of important here. One of the things about words that they can do that paintings, pictures, and images cannot do is they can contain propositions, clearly defined propositions. And I would say, we could add that, we could say linguistic propositions, or propositions in linguistic form. So we have to get clear about this. It's very important to be clear. So what that means is I can show you a picture, for example, of an orange sitting on a table. And you can say, well, the orange represents this and that, and the table represents such and so. But if I write to you and I say, Ben, there's an orange sitting on the table, I believe that it is the case that there's an orange sitting on the table. The proposition, there is an orange sitting on the table, is communicated with language. If I just showed you a picture of an orange on a table, you'd be like, I don't know what it is you're telling me. Do you want me to pay attention to the lighting or to the cinematography? Like, what is it that you're doing? Propositions, then, propositions are made possible through language. I was going to say they're a property of language, but that's not necessarily the case, because we can have I can think of a linguistic system that contains no propositions, where everything is merely artistic, and therefore contains no propositions. So, but we're going to say that only language, and I'm going to say with words and syntax, some philosopher language is going to get really, really, really upset with me for not going through the history of Frege and Russell and Kripke. You didn't mention denoting and the difference between denotation and connotation.
I always get those two mixed up.
You didn't properly demarcate the difference between intentionality with a T and intentionality with an S. I know. We're making sure that everyone else gets caught up to us all. Okay? We'll be fine. So, words allow us to have propositional truths and to make declarative statements that are clearly defined in a way that images don't. And we are now moving, and it used to be that the the dominant, preeminent way of communicating ideas was through the spoken word originally, and then it moved to the written word, where the written word allows us to take a piece of writing and think about it over and over and over again and look at it for absolute precision.
Mm-hmm.
We're now moving to an image culture. We are living in a world of images. So, we have to find something here.
Well, just a subnote while you're looking up your things. The image of a flag can say quite a bit on Twitter. That's a declarative statement. I stand with Ukraine, or I am a gender-critical thinker, or trans rights activist, or an American, or a MAGA, right? So the emoji straddles the line between, propositional and imagistic forms of speech. The label, the tag, the identity. While we are moving into the world of the image, we're taking with us this kind of tribal or denotative kind of substance or way of relating to one another by claiming my pronouns or by, stating, I stand with Ukraine, etc.
So words properly constructed, I don't mean symbols, I mean words. There's a difference between writing the words I stand with Ukraine or I believe that the Ukrainians are correct in the dispute between Ukraine and Russia, and having a thumbs up sign and a Ukraine flag. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
There is a difference between the putting a Ukrainian flag in your bio and saying, I support the creation of a no-fly zone over the Ukraine by America and its allies. Right? One of those is propositional. The other one is a symbolic. It's emotive.
Yeah.
It's not that it doesn't say anything, and it's not that it doesn't contain meaning.
Yeah.
It's that the merely placing of a Ukrainian flag as a symbol does not itself illocute a proposition. It does not speak forth or convey straightforwardly a proposition.
Yeah, it's an affiliation. One can assume at this point in time that somebody's standing for or would be for helping Ukraine, but this says nothing about how.
Right. Those precise propositions are not contained therein. Okay?
Yeah.
So maybe I should get a little bit clear about what a proposition is real quick. A proposition is something like the cat is on the mat.
Right over there.
Okay?
Yeah.
Actually, is your cat on the mat? Do you have a cat in the room?
She's on a gray kind of piece of fabric.
Okay, so the cat is on the gray piece of fabric.
Yeah.
So it's a statement or sentence that is also which is an assertion or expression of a truth or a fact, an opinion, or a judgment.
Yeah.
It's a statement. You might say that it's a statement that expresses a thing that can either be true or false. That might be another nice way to catch a proposition. Okay? So language makes possible for propositional truth. Images can express meaning which is can catch things like not just emotional, but it can catch beauty, ugliness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of non-propositional bits of meaning,
more like
Sublimity.
sensate or phenomenal kind of things.
Sensations, things which happen in the heart and soul. You can create art and beauty with language. Think of poetry or think of songs. Some enterprising musician who wanted to sing beautifully might sing something like "How Great Thou Art." Yeah. That might be a thing someone who does. Or the American national anthem, or the Oscar Mayer Wiener song, or whatever it is. Paintings can capture absurdity, humor. There's lots of things that images can do, but what they can't get is propositions. Okay? So when Jacques Ellul was writing about the humiliation of the word, what he was talking about was once the word is the dominant way of thinking about the world gets knocked off of its pedestal, the result of this is that the propositional truth, which is carried along with that, also is dethroned. And because the word gets knocked off, the natural way of thinking about the world is not necessarily propositional, and therefore questions of truth and falsity are not necessarily on the table. So my suggestion is that we are kind of playing intellectual games in a world that is entirely now constructed of images. You might think about it that way. You might say that the academic and intellectual ground is being contested in a social world that is built out of images and video. So what I said was, we're playing word games in a reality constructed entirely of images. We treat words like images, and then propositions disappear. So we no longer treat words as their propositional value. We imbue them with a sort of symbolic value.
Example. Yesterday, Mark Hamill, who's the actor who played Luke Skywalker in the little-known film Star Wars, the first three ones at least, well, which are the middle three ones, he posted to Twitter, gay, 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 rainbow emoji.
Yes, that is an example of words being used entirely symbolically. There's no proposition there. That's not a propositional statement. That's a symbolic statement.
Would that apply to trans women are women? That's a proposition, but it still has the ring of a thought terminating cliche or something that is.
Yes,
it's propositional, but it's symbolic because it doesn't make sense.
Propositions can be used symbolically. So that's a proposition that's being used symbolically.
Okay.
Right? That's a proposition being put to use in a particular way.
So to expand on that, is it not just we're not just in a imagistic society, but we're going to a symbolic rather than declarative.
Yeah. We're moving into the realm where words are treated like images.
Huh.
Words are bound by logic. There is a boundary for words with logic. Propositions are bound by logic. You can't have contradictory propositions and have them both be true because it creates cognitive dissonance. If I say the cat is on the mat and you say that very same cat is also at the very same time not on the mat at all, we would have questions. Are you married, sir?
More or less.
If you and your wife were walking around downtown and someone said, "Are you pregnant?" and she said, "I am absolutely pregnant. Yes, I am." And you said, "She is not pregnant at all, and there is no plans to be pregnant or to have children at any time." People wouldn't say, yes, that makes perfect sense." They would say, maybe these two need to go see, Jordan Peterson and have a talk about their marriage.
Yeah.
Maybe she didn't tell him yet. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe this is some sort of absurdist, parodic, expressionist art thing. They wouldn't say, "Okay, that makes perfect sense. She says she's pregnant. He says she isn't pregnant. They're both correct. Let's move on with life." Like that. That wouldn't make any. Maybe they're not speaking the same language. Maybe somebody misheard the question, but nobody would say, "Yep, that makes perfect sense." Or if I said, "How much money did you make?" and you said, "I made $1,000 American," and your boss says, "I paid him $10,000 American." At some point, someone would say, "Well, maybe the bank messed up. Maybe there was a problem with the check getting written." We wouldn't consider it to be answered, right? That's the law of non-contradiction. Words and propositions are bound by things like logic and coherency. Images are not. There are no limits to the interpretations, meanings that we can draw from an image. We can take anything we want. Words have syntax and logic. They have propositional content in a way that image does not. There are rules to language, not just syntax and grammar in the sense of we have to appropriately order our verbs and nouns and articles, but there's a logical syntax that's in play when propositions are expressed. So there are boundaries, there are rules, there are forms, there are lines in the sand, so to speak, that restrict propositions in a particular way. And if we violate those, we can say, well, that's an absurdity, or that there's a contradiction, or that there's something incoherent, and then we know we have to get clear. Images are not like that. I can look at an image and there are any number of interpretations I can have of it. And there is no boundary. There's no syntax to images. There is no requirement for an image to be coherent. For example, you can think of many of the absurdist paintings of someone like, I don't know, Salvador Dali, with melting clocks, or the work of Jackson Pollock. I have no idea what it would mean, where he just splattered paint onto the page. I have no idea what it is to say a paint spatter is logically invalid. Logical validity is not a property of paint splatter. So that doesn't work. So the result now is that we've moved from this written culture to the verbal culture. From the verbal culture to the written culture, from the written culture to the image culture. And in the process, the propositional is being dethroned, and with it, truth. Now, someone is going to say that I have an overly, what would you say, simplistic definition of truth, because they're going to say, look, truth is not just propositional truth. Okay, fine. I will grant that. There can be artistic truths. There can be perhaps spiritual truths. There can be truths about beauty. You could say that the arrow flies straight and true. That all can stick around. But propositional truth, once you dethrone the word, propositional truth begins to be also dethroned and begins to move, to sink, to fall, to become flattened. So, what does this mean? Well, what it means is we've left ourselves vulnerable, because art can spread ideas through images which go through the eyes directly into the heart and are then felt as truth without ever having to be touched by the mind and tested against reason and reality. Let me say that again. Art can spread ideas through images which go through the eyes directly into the heart and then are felt as truth without ever having to be touched by the mind and tested against reason and reality. So, if someone comes along to you and says trans women are women, or that men can give birth, immediately you begin running along your definitions of what counts as a man and what counts as a woman, and you begin testing that against reality, and then you begin testing the statement using logic. Is a man can give birth? Is that sound? Is the deduction of the premises valid? Does it contradict if I take all the propositions that I know from evolutionary biology and I line those up, and then I add trans women are women, or I add the proposition men can give birth to that list of propositions? Is there a contradiction there? You can do that when someone uses the proposition trans women are women. But when someone switches out and instead communicates their entire ideology artistically or symbolically, or instead of using trans women or women as a proposition which can be tested, they treat it as an ethical, as a, what would you say, as a symbol to be agreed with in order to prove you're a good person. Not a proposition which can be tested against logic and reality, or can be tested with, or can be subjected to tests of coherency and tests of contradiction, you might say. Once that proposition is no longer treated as a proposition to be examined either empirically, logically, through reason, and it becomes purely a symbolic thing, it becomes a sort of verbal image, which can then mean a multiplicity of things to a multiplicity of different people. Which is why when Matt Walsh went on the Dr. Phil show, he said, "What's a woman?" And the person said, "Well, I don't want to say what a woman is. A woman can mean different things to different people." Because there's no longer the word woman no longer has a clearly defined definition which sets its boundaries. There is no boundaries. Woman just means whatever anyone wants it to mean. Or it has no boundaries. It can mean anything. We don't want to limit it.
Mm-hmm.
So once all of this happens, you end up with a situation where you're communicating entirely through images, and images have a way of being able to go directly through the eye, directly into the heart, without ever being tested by the intellect. They're never subjected to that. And that's a serious problem, because that places the artist with the capacity to be able to embed ideas in a sort of non-propositional way, or to bring in a certain sort of perspective on the world in a way that bypasses the mind and goes directly through to the heart. And that's a serious problem. And so somebody comes along and says, and sees, so you see this a lot in places like Tumblr, where they'll make trans art about what they're going to look like when they finish transitioning and how happy they're going to be. And they're baked into those artistic expressions is the idea of being trans and being happy. And a whole lot of other ideological machinery that goes into them thinking that way is left out. All you see is them being trans and being happy and having a particular look. All of the intellectual work that goes into them believing that, all of the propositions that led them to that are not in the painting. All that they see is the image. And so what that means is all of that intellectual machinery never gets tested against reason. It never gets tested against reality. It never gets tested for coherency or validity or soundness. All of those logical properties, the propositions that linguistic propositions are subjected to are not present in images. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is, because we live in a world of images, we live in a world of video, we have a really interesting scenario. And that scenario is this. The generation today is a generation that speaks with images, listens with their eyes, thinks with their feelings, and decides with their hearts. Let me see if I can say that again. That was good. We now
well,
we
you
live in a world.
You said it on camera, so somebody can just rewind it.
I want to make sure I want to make sure I fully agree with that statement. Yeah. We speak with images, hear with our eyes, think with our feelings, and decide with our hearts. Yeah, that's what's going on. The intellect is bypassed. Images have a way of going around the intellect and going straight for the emotion. The images, it is possible with a well-shot video to hijack the mind through the heart and through emotion in a way that it's very difficult to do with writing. It can be done with writing, but it's a lot harder. And once you're living in a written culture, when you're making your decisions and you're expressing them and thinking and discussing them propositionally, they're always subjected to the boundaries of logic and syntax. So, let's do something with that. Okay? I apologize to the atheists, but I will be using a biblical example. So, the image, what's contained within the image, the aesthetic elements, the sublimity, the humor, the joy, the emotive elements, the awe and inspiration that can be brought in. That's all good. But there's an order, there's a way that this needs to go. So I'm going to do something with that here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And how did he do that? He spoke them into being. So first, we have the word, right? In God's mind, the world is as an idea. And he says, let there be light. He speaks into existence. So first, and then, I mean, you can hear this echoed slightly in John. He says, in the beginning was the word. And what he means by that is the logos. Roughly something like the raison d'etre, the reason for being, the all-consuming reason and rationality of the world, that which makes sense or gives reason or gives rationality to the world, something like that. Okay? When we say logos, we mean roughly something like that. Okay? And so, in a very real sense, we have in the beginning was the word, was the logos, and we have God speaking things in. So we start with propositions. We start with language, right? In the beginning was the word. We have a logos to begin with. We have propositions, okay? So we have that. So what's the thing
that sounds disconnected? That sounds like the mind just kind of is separate from the world and creates the world. But if you stack that up against evolutionary biology, what do you see? You don't see the word come first. You see maybe the urge or the will come first. The drive, maybe the hunger, the expression. Way before the word.
You could define it as it's the logos is that which provides the reason, the wisdom of the world. You could define it as the divine wisdom that is expressed through the order of the world, and is manifested in various ways. The rational principles that are the overarching meta of the universe and of existence, that provide the coherency and that tie the world and the universe together. That's what we mean by logos, right? So let me go back and do something with this. So the first thing, we have God. In the beginning was the word, the logos, right? The that which makes the universe and the world reasonable and understandable and coherent, right? That's what we're starting off with. The rational principles that are governing and developing the universe, right? In the beginning was the word. Okay? So we start with the word, then we get reality. So the word, right? Those rational principles, right? That are embedded in language, the word, the reasoned discourse, the ideas of God, which presumably are coherent and make sense, right? We start with that. So first, reality is bound by the logos. Reality is bound by rational principles. Okay? What's the second thing that we get? We get the world. So we start with the words, which bind everything through with logic and coherence, right? Through logical coherence, right? And through syntax. And then we get the world, and the world binds us with other things. We are constrained by the world physically through the laws of nature, right? So we start off, first we get the word, then we get the world. And then once he does that, God says, let us create man in our image. Yeah. First we get the word, then we get the world, then we get the image. Because the image is the thing that needs to be constrained by the word in the world, otherwise it goes off its rocker, right? So what we start off with the world, with the rational principles that govern reality. Then we get with the word, the logos. Then we get the world, and we get the laws of nature which govern the physical universe. Then we get the image, bound by both of those things.
Why is image unbound by that, left to its own devices? Why is the imagination
because
so
the
unwieldy?
Because the imagination is not bound by physical laws, and the imagination, because it can be non-propositional, isn't bound by logical laws. So here's the point. We start with the logos, we get the rational principles that govern reality. And then we get the world, which we get laws of nature that govern the physical world. Then we get the image. The beginning was the word, not in the beginning was video. There's a reason for that.
There's this clip of Kamala Harris from a couple days ago. They had some sort of summit about green energy, and she said she's been stringing together these really crazy sentences, but she said something to the effect that we're all here because you all imagined the future. You can see the future unbound by what came before and make that which is possible actual.
Imagine a future. The freight trucks that deliver bread and milk to our grocery store shelves, and the buses that take children to school and parents to work. Imagine all the heavy-duty vehicles that keep our supply lines strong and allow our economy to grow. Imagine that they produced zero emissions. Well, you all imagined it. That's why we're here today. Because we have the ability to see what can be, unburdened by what has been, and then to make the possible actually happen.
Which doesn't really mean anything, but she's kind of summoning what you're saying. It's this, if you can imagine it, then you can make it possible. Somehow we can force everybody to drive electric cars and just let go of gasoline because you imagined it. And then we're going to enforce this, not based on reality or what came before, the world, but based purely on the will, and that will is informed by the heart, this desire driven by fear and the hope of a purely, zero emissions utopia that saves the world.
That's right. And so that's exactly it, right? So let me see if I can take all of this. I'm just going to try and put this into like a 3-minute soundbite. That way we can go viral on YouTube.
Finally, yeah.
Finally, or at least we can get mildly retweeted on Twitter. Let's follow the voice of Dr. Peterson, and let's set ourselves a reasonable goal. Mildly retweeted. Okay. So what Kamala is doing there is she's saying we want to look at we can imagine it. Anything we can imagine, we can do. But the imagination, untethered to the world and untethered to reason, can go any direction it wants. But reason and the world can't. So, to sum it up, let me see if I can do this in under 2 minutes. The very first thing that we find in scriptures, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. Right? Then it says, let there be light. So the first thing that we have is God speaking the words, and that comes out of his creativity, but God is speaking the words. He's got intentions, he's got ideas, and he speaks propositionally. That's the first thing that happens. Then, after he speaks, we get the world. First come the words, then come the world. John, in the book of John, says, in the beginning was the Word, which means in the beginning was the Logos. In the beginning were the rational principles that govern reality. And then God knows them, embodies them, is them. Bang. Creates using words, and then we get the world. So we start with the Word, then we move to the world. Once you have the Word, and you've got the world, and the world is going to have laws to it. It's going to have the physical laws of physics, laws of thermodynamics. So first we have the Word, which is subject to the rules of logic, to the laws of propositions, to truth and falsity, right? Those are the rational principles. Then we have the world, which is governed by physical laws and physical rules. And then he says, let us make man in our image. First comes the world, then comes the word, then we get the image.
Okay.
In the beginning was the word, not in the beginning was video. You don't get the image and the imagination that comes with it until you are bound by rationality, reason, logic, and the physical world. When you are bound by the world and bound by the word, then you can have the imagination. But if you start with the imagination unbound by the world and unbound by the word, you get off into all kinds of craziness. That's when you fall off. That's when things get unhinged.
There is a slippage there. If human beings or mankind was created in God's image, then human beings ostensibly have the same desire to emulate God in speaking reality into being, into proclaiming the image of the future or the image of something, and then enforcing that somehow. And if those people actually have amassed a bunch of power, which did derive from the world and did derive by rational means through exploitation or non-exploitation of other people, right? They amassed enough resources to enforce the image. That image can be enforced to a certain degree, but not without consequences. There's some sort of fall that happens because, let's just say, if the Biden administration just in perpetuity gets to do what they want, strips everybody of their gasoline and installs a bunch of batteries from I don't know where, but they somehow do that. They create a bunch of electrical vehicles and a bunch of infrastructure and a huge electrical grid that's not running on anything but wind. I mean, even if it was the case, they have such a limited, they are not God. They can't just speak that into being. And because their imagination is not tethered and not checked by just basic rational principles and realistic expectations, then it's going to run afoul by becoming completely totalitarian and just wasting a bunch of resources that could be spent on, not that.
That's right. Right. And yeah, that's exactly right. It's because when the imagination isn't tethered to the world and isn't tethered to reality, it can go wherever it wants.
Yeah. But God can do that. But God's a different being, different order.
God, for God is the Logos. He embodies the rationality, right, and the governing principles of the universe. So he doesn't contradict himself, and he doesn't whatever. I apologize to the atheists among us. Yeah. You'll be fine.
Can God make a rock that God can't lift, kind of thing?
Yes, I know. Yeah. And I also, to the Christians who are going to nitpick this by quoting John Frame and Louis Burkhoff at me, I don't. We just need to calm down. Okay. The point is that I'm just using this to draw out the illustration that the imagination, that creative has to be subservient to the structures of the world, right? The problem is once you assert that the social constructs are all that matter, and you can socially construct things entirely with images, and you can what's a nice term for it? Deconstruct anything. You can untether the imagination from the world and from the word, because it becomes entirely subjective, right? Once you remove objectivity from the game, right? And what are rational rules that govern the world and the laws of nature if not objective? Those are the objective things within which the subjective image can play and create. But if you get rid of that objectivity and say it's the subjective thing is all that matters, there's no guidelines or boundaries. There's nothing to stop things from crashing.
Well, yeah, it's just a matter of time. Even if you were completely rational and objective, you're still going to crash because, again, you're not God. Even if you play by the rules.
You're finite, yes. And our finite nature, that's right. But our finite nature is not to be confused with the detethering. See, my finite nature means I can't have a full grasp on all of objectivity. But that's a very different thing from saying we're going to get rid of our tethered objectivity entirely. Mm-hmm. It's one thing for me to say I'm tethered to the objective world I'm tethered to the objective world via reason and my faculties, and say, look, my faculties are limited. They're not perfect. and I am a person, am finite, and therefore I can't grasp all of the objective world, and therefore I can't grab the entirety of the logos and the entirety of the physical world. I can't perfectly at every moment what's the word? Apprehend all of the ways in which the rational rules for reality and the rules of laws of nature are physically tied together. I can't apprehend all of that at once because I'm a finite creature. But I can be tethered to the world. And I can, as much as I am able, try to test my beliefs and my goals and my imaginative yearnings against what is possible. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's possible, I think, and I mean, this is where the creatives could have a point, that sometimes people are overly restrictive. I mean, we do need rules for the road, but saying that the speed limit shall be 1 kilometer an hour and you can't go more than 5 feet per day lest somebody have an accident, that's overly restrictive. And I understand that. But once you bring in the postmodern, the deconstruction of everything that exists, oh man, you are unchaining that imagination from the world. And so we're seeing this most clearly in the transgender discussion, the transgender, let's be postmodern, in the discourse of in the current transgender discourse, mm-hmm. where they seek to use a combination of fear, panic, and emotion to bypass the intellect. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're all going to kill themselves. The kids are going to kill themselves if you don't give in. And you sit back and go, wow, that immediately moves the conversation away from a calm discussion about, okay, what is the truth here? And that immediately moves it to an emotive perspective of, oh no, people are going to die. We must do something. And then once you've moved the conversation into a panic-filled, fear-filled mode, or panic-filled, fear-filled milieu, it's real easy to use images to just say, look at how happy these trans people are. Look at how happy Jazz Jennings is. Look at how happy this other trans person is. And then you kind of go through the detransitioned Reddit and you realize that a lot of those images are showing a portion, and they're not showing the underlying struggle that lies underneath. Yeah. And the questions about why people are going through these dysphoric feelings, the questions about why there really does appear to be an element of social contagion to all of this, the question of how did it become the case where 30% of Gen Z began to identify as queer? How did that occur? Why is that happening? How did it get to be the case where everyone who doesn't fit the stereotype of a Hallmark movie immediately declares a new gender, gets their new flag, is shuffled into their hierarchy in the LGBTQ thing, and then becomes an activist? Gay. That's right. You know, I'm not sure I want to date somebody right now. Okay, so you are asexual. Here's your flag. Here's your order in the speaking thing. Okay. Well, you know, I'm really only attracted to people for emotional reasons. I got to say, demisexual. Here's your flag. Here's your word. Here's your order in the
hierarchy.
The hierarchy. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I find myself, you know, really being attracted to people's minds, not necessarily. I'm just attracted to how somebody thinks and not necessarily what they look like. Oh, here's your word, sapiosexual. Here's your flag, yada-da-da-da. Here's your place in the hierarchy, yada-da-da-da. And all of a sudden, what you end up with is a bean counting paint by numbers intersectionality, which is an attempt to try and organize a thing that was created entirely in the imagination and devoid of reality.
Well, no, it's
this stuff
actively was contemptuous of reality if you go into queer theory, if you go into its roots.
Yes, because queer theory wants to get away from what? It's openly hostile to what? Rationality, and it's openly hostile to science. Why? Well, they've dismissed our descriptions of those laws of nature as being merely the product of a system that was created by and for white men, and therefore contains within it a series of ideas, concepts, and ideas which are serving at the behest of an oppressive social structure. They are created by and for the benefit of white males, and therefore they are structurally racist and sexist in various ways, and therefore can't be trusted.
Is there a status quo sexuality? Do I get a flag? Am I turned on by the status quo being a white privileged male?
That's you are cisgendered and heterosexual.
I'm cishet.
Or sexual.
Cishet normative.
Here's your flag. Here's your flag. Here's your place in the structure.
Yeah. Here's my word.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone gets a word. Everyone gets a flag. Everyone gets a symbol. Everyone gets a place in the structure.
Okay.
Because we're all unique and different.
We're all okay. So
we're
I
all
wanna,
very unique and different, which is why we all get a word and a flag and a place in the hierarchy, because we're all special and totally unique and completely different.
And queer,
just
we're all
like
queer.
Everyone else.
Yeah, we're
all
queer.
special and different, just like everyone else.
So I want to move the conversation a little bit, broaden it a little bit. There's this really interesting phenomena where, let's say, people who were basing their identities on social media by appending a shot emoji and a masked emoji into their bios or into their names, all of a sudden that shot emoji and mask emoji were replaced by the Ukrainian flag, like overnight, in droves. Hundreds of thousands of people switched overnight. So there's one level where we can talk about the weird, maybe there's a conspiracy going on, maybe it's groupthink, or maybe it's just the political flag, maybe it's leftism, blah, blah, blah. But just within the bounds of what you're talking about this attenuation to this imagistic, imaginal sort of communication and identity or prophilicity, as Mueller would put it. What are some of your thoughts on that sea change in identification or in virtue signaling?
So first of all, let's stop to note that all of that is done via images.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, we're using the image. And the second thing is that we have to notice is there was a satirical article by the Babylon Bee which I just thought it was hilarious. And it said that Vladimir Putin will get the Nobel Prize in Medicine for having ended the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just about died. So part of this, we need to understand that the kind of we're living in postmodernity, and these people are operating in a postmodern world. And in the postmodern world, the only thing that you have access to, the only things that exist, which you can say anything about, are things that you experience. So you have your access to your subjectivity. Okay? And the thing that they are concerned with is the social world. And so the only thing that really matters to them is a combination of descriptions of the social world and their subjective experience. Now, they also place a huge emphasis on discourse. And so they're very, very concerned about how the discourse influences the society. And so what they care about is the ways in which meaning, as broadly construed, is carried through the world. So, what do I mean by that? The thing, when they talk about discourse, they're talking about the way we talk about, discuss, indicate, suggest, message, opine, anything that carries meaning. All the ways in which we communicate our ideas, thoughts, feelings, opinions. So, books, movies, television, video, TikTok, words, pamphlets, art pieces, billboards,
T-shirts.
fashion, colors, T-shirts, haircuts, anything that can be symbolic or that can carry meaning, particularly social meaning, but meaning broadly construed. Implications, entailments, conclusions, anything like that. I will once again ask those of you who are going to start yelling at me that I don't know anything about philosophy to consider that I've read John Searle's Intentionality and that I'm drawing heavily on his work here, but I'm trying to teach it to an audience. Thank you. So anything that comes from the mind of humans which can be communicated is what they are concerned with. We might call those things intentional. With a T. And so, but Mike, you're using postmodernism. Yes, I know Derrida as well. Yes, I know. I know Searle wasn't postmodern. Calm down. My view of postmodernity and how language actually functions over and above the way the postmoderns think it functions is what's driving me here. Calm down. Go read Kripke or something. And so, but what about Frege? What about Hillary Putnam, XYZ, and water and H2O? Okay, I'll stop. So, they're very concerned about any kind of intentionality or meaning or thought or feeling or concept or desire that can be communicated into the world. And they think that's the whole show. And because of that, what they're always looking at is the discourse and how that functions in society and how that structures society, how that sets up society, how that influences society, and who benefits. And they also then are very concerned with that, how it reflects on them. In their view, they must be seen to be doing the right thing. Doing the right thing by itself is not enough. Because what matters is the discourse. So we want to be seen to be doing the right thing. Because by being seen to be doing the right thing, we are speaking and we are communicating into the discourse and we are changing the discourse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that's the thing that matters. What they think about it, and there's something to that. You can't just throw that away as being silly because, like, I mean, people say, look, if you change someone's mind, you can change the world, right? I mean, if we manage to convince Vladimir Putin to be woke and immediately exit Ukraine, then you could look and say, hey, man, the discourse
Those two
worked.
things don't have to be the same. He could leave Ukraine and not become
without being woke. But I'm saying from the perspective, if we're gonna grasp on to the most postmodern view of it and say, look, what we need Putin to do is do the work of deconstructing his poisonous ideology so that he can become a better person, so that he can decolonize his thinking and become an anti-racist. He might change his thinking, and then if he changed his thinking, he'd change his behavior. Mm-hmm. So you could almost have a really sympathetic view. In fact, you could make their view almost intuitive by saying, look, man, don't focus on the behavior, focus on the thinking that leads to the behavior. And if you change the thinking, then you change the behavior. And where does the thinking come from? It comes from the things that Putin picked up from the world. So if you change the discourses in the world, you change the thinking that people will pick up, and you change their behavior. You can almost make it intuitive.
But where does it break
almost
down?
makes Well, because that's not how people operate. Because people aren't robots that just pick up their programming from society, from the social world. See, the problem is that they've assumed a sort of, how would you say it? Oh, what's the correct way to put this? They have assumed a kind of structural determinism, we'll call it that. That's a term of art. Where people are determined by their place in the world and the discourses which program all the behavior and which structure the society. Okay, so I asked, why does Robin DiAngelo think all white people are racist? Well, the answer to that is structural determinism. Structural determinism says that the structure of a signifying system, such as language, determines how individuals socialized within that system think and act. Let's unpack that. The idea is that we think and communicate using language, and that we can only think using the concepts available to us in the language that we speak. If language is like a toolbox and words are like tools, the idea is that we can only communicate using the tools in our toolbox. This means that all of our thinking, creating, judging, and reasoning are limited, constrained, and directed, you might say determined, by the concepts available to us. We can only build the conceptual houses that our tools will allow. But it isn't just language in the sense of what words are in the dictionary. They think that language is the box that holds all the concepts that previous generations created, and thus the language comes loaded with the conceptual and ideological baggage of the people who created it. So it isn't just that there's words in dictionaries, it's all of this ideology is baked in there. You won't find it in any one of the definitions, but if you look at how all the words relate to each other and the structure of the language and how it operates, you can find it. You'd have to deconstruct the language to do this. The language here includes the grammar, idioms, sayings, terms of art, syntax, anything that's part of the language. The idea is that the language is built to express certain ideas, so use of that language gravitates towards the ideas that the language was created to produce. Now, structural determinism is not only concerned with language. All facets of society and the whole of society itself are structured to produce certain outcomes. Why? Because they're created by people using the language, ideas, syntax, and idioms of the white oppressive structure. And so that white oppressive structure is embedded directly into the language, thoughts, ideas, ideologies, everything that is part of the larger discourse. Mm-hmm. In this view, everything that makes up the social world is structured to produce particular outcomes, namely, to the benefit of cisgendered heterosexual white males. So, critical race theory, for example, in its postmodern iterations, is going to think that everything in society is structured to produce white dominance or produce a world in which whiteness is dominant in society. As such, all the elements of society are always working to socialize and condition everyone to accept a hierarchy of white dominance. That's the view. So
once you embed that into political structure, then you can swap out any given activist end to mobilize the entire superstructure. So just to expand on that, we have a bunch, 10,000, 100,000 people putting Ukraine flags and then doing all these campaigns to stop all of these companies from even doing business in Russia. And then you have the entire financial sector almost completely, like these non-sovereign states are joining in a war because they're all motivated by a specific narrative. Now, I'm not defending Putin's action against Ukraine, but I am questioning how everybody can be on board without thinking through the consequences of all this stuff and without thinking about what that means about financial institutions becoming politicized, about where I can buy my coffee is now politicized. Everything is politicized.
Because when you can control, this is their great insight, is once you can control the discourse, everything follows. Yeah. Human beings are in many ways discursive creatures. And it is pretty easy to side against Putin in this. That's fairly simple to do. I mean, he's wrong. But this is people who are, all these companies pulling out of Russia. Everyone says, yes, good. Good. And nobody's stopping to think and ask, what happens when they say, we debanked the Russians? Okay. Do you agree with Barack Obama? No. Debanked. What?
Why? What?
You don't
Trudeau
like George
did that
W.
2
Bush?
weeks before Ukraine. Trudeau did that 2 weeks before Ukraine, reversed that. So everybody would, I don't know why, I'm just appending intentionality to him, but he played his hand, and that's a dangerous freaking hand. They are willing to do that, and Biden didn't stand up against that. I mean, whoever is running this country, nobody in the Western world said, Trudeau, you shouldn't go there. I mean, individuals did, and banks probably. Yeah, Jordan Peterson, individuals did. People who are not beholden
people
to
in
the
the
infrastructure.
People in the Bitcoin space were saying you better start building some infrastructure, and they're right. So what's happened is because of the discursive hijacking,
yeah,
and what has happened is, at one time, if you think back to the development of what we might call reputation, if you think back maybe 1,000 years ago, your reputation would exist amongst how many people? Right? There's no videos, there's no cameras. So you work with people that you really trust. And so your reputation matters a lot, because your reputation is your access to everything. Right? There's no way to prove your innocence by presenting a videotape, for example, that's exculpatory. Right? As we move in through the 20th century, we that begins to fall apart, because now we have a lot. Our how would you put this? It becomes a lot easier to demonstrate that you've done good work. For example, I could take pictures of all the houses I've built, and I can show that to people. I'd say, look at all the great work I've done. Even look at, I went to Germany, I did all this good work. Here are all the pictures. Here are the phone numbers of the people. You can call them and ask them. 1,000 years ago, that wasn't possible. If you went from Germany to England and you say, hey, I built a bunch of good work really in Germany, people say, well, how do we know you did that? There's no way to prove it. So at that time, reputation is very, very, very important. It becomes a little bit less important as we move into the 20th century, because if someone slanders your reputation, you can just say, well, here's pictures of the work I did. I can just prove that I do good work. It matters less. But now we are in a hyper-social world. And because we're in a hyper-social world, the importance of reputation is beginning to come back into the fore again. And reputation operates at the level of... Reputations are made and broken at the level of discourse and social pressure. So all of that
association.
All of those social games that used to be played when you could destroy somebody with gossip at your local church, imagine that on a society-wide scale, and that's what we're heading into.
Well, no, we're fully entrenched.
Right? And because of that, again, because it's not tethered from reality, and it can be done through insinuation without having any proposition that's true or false, well, you know what he's like with women. What's he like with women? Mm-hmm. You know. There's no proposition there, but there's an insinuation. Mm-hmm. And you can't test an insinuation with logic, can you? Because you don't know exactly what's being insinuated, and it can be dodged. I didn't say that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wasn't calling you a pedophile. I'm just asking you to prove that you're not.
It's the Duke Kwon theory of social behavior, right? Where he said of Reverend Kevin DeYoung, he goes, Kevin DeYoung is performing the basic impulses of white supremacy. Kevin DeYoung may not be a white supremacist, but he performs its basic impulses.
Okay.
I don't know how to falsify that. Right? But if you say, he can say, I didn't call him a white supremacist. I never said that. I said he performed the basic impulses of white supremacy. I didn't say it was a white supremacist. I never called him a racist. And it's like, no, what you did is you found a clever linguistic construction with which you could splash the social stench of white supremacy all over Kevin DeYoung without looking like you're doing it and giving yourself the vaguest, thinnest veneer of an excuse to get out of the charge that you're slandering him. Sorry. Libeling him.
This also works in reverse, or in a positive sense, where instead of actually having to come up with a rational argument, you could just pin a certain flag into your profile. So any move to support Ukraine, no matter how disastrous that move might be, they are signing up for, but they are disassociating from any of the actual consequences of any particular policy, because there's no argument, there's no real proposition. It's an affiliation.
That's right. That's right. So I am pro-Ukraine generally. Okay, go Ukraine. In what way are we pro-Ukraine? What are we actually going to do? What is our goal here? And what are the consequences that's going to be, and are we willing to pay them? You took out your... I mean, someone pointed this out with Eric Feigelding, the COVID guy who wrote a Holy Mother of God thread a couple of years ago about COVID-19, and then went from having 2,000 followers to having like 500,000 or like 600 or whatever it is now, and is now having appearances on CNN and all the rest of it, and they pointed out how his bio went from purely COVID-19 to being like biosecurity now. Now it's not. It was Neon Stater who did it, or Neon Taster who did it, and he said, "Yeah, watch the evolution of Eric Feigelding's bio," because people who are realizing that their relevance and their platform was tied to COVID-19 need to get to something else. That's what they were on about. Their level of importance and the way in which they appreciated within the social hierarchy was due to COVID-19. So now they've moved to something else. Like, there's a meme about this on Facebook where people said, somebody did one of those tweets where someone's like, well, after years of having done this, I've decided to move to another organization. So it'll be like, after years of working here at the New York Times, I've decided to move out, and I've gone on my own, and I'll be starting a new media company that focuses on storytelling. It's a career change. And everyone goes, yay. But this guy wrote and said, after years and years, after 2.5 years of being an expert on the COVID-19 pandemic, I'd like to announce that I've moved and I've decided to become an expert in Russia-Ukraine relations. Yeah. I appreciate your support at this difficult time. It's like, what? Like, it's like, what? Like, what the hell are you doing?
It also obfuscates responsibility by those in charge. So Biden can come out and say that all of this inflation, all of this gas has to do with Ukraine.
Yep.
And everybody will buy it because the whole narrative, it supports Ukraine. Therefore, Ukraine is the fault and the cause of every other value.
It's an interesting tactic that gets used, but I just want to point out, like, I kept my mouth shut largely about COVID-19. I was careful. I mean, I got my vaccines when I thought they were appropriate. I was careful. I did a thread on Russia, and it was, and so there's a problem with people who are experts on COVID-19 who then become experts on something else. Now, I don't think that people can't have opinions. For example, I did a thread back in December. And in that thread, I noted that the Russian hockey team had been wearing the jerseys of the Soviet Union at the Moscow Cup. Or sorry, at the was it Spengler Cup? It was a cup in a hockey cup tournament and I can't remember the name of the cup that they were fighting for, but it was in Moscow. I think it was the Moscow Cup. I'm not sure. Anyway, and I said, for those of you who are keeping track, I was like, here's Putin putting the Soviet jerseys, watch out. And why I said that was, having lived in Canada, we are taught, and it is a great source of national pride, that in 1972, the Canadian team won the 72 Summit Series against the Russians, against the Soviet Union. And the reason that was a big deal is because the Russians had at that point, I think, won however many gold medals it was in a row, 20 or something like this, gold medals or 10 or whatever it was in a row, and had dominated the international hockey scene. And our Canada had always said, look, your Red Army team that you send to the Olympics, they're really a professional team. They practice like professionals. They train as professionals. This is what they do. They do this full time. The guys that we send are college players or juniors, true amateurs, people who play hockey on the side. Our professionals who play full time could beat your full time players. So we beat them. And anytime that's talked about in Canada, one of the points of contention that's always brought up is that hockey is a proxy for the effectiveness of the system. And because hockey is a proxy for the effectiveness of the system, it was used as a way of the Soviets and the Canadians testing themselves against each other. And basically what Canada was doing when we beat the Soviets was saying, you can do whatever you want, but our liberal democracy produces a superior product. And we have 1/10 of your population. So, with that context, if you pay attention to how, and I don't want to get too deep into this right now, but if you pay attention to how hockey goes in Russia, hockey is very important. Hockey is a proxy for the health of the nation. They take it quite seriously. So, and Putin, I mean, one of the things that Putin did during his time was to focus on bringing important players from the history of Russian hockey into prominence and doing things like building arenas. Like that was a part of the national government strategy because they view it as something that matters. Okay? And national pride and nationalism is something that matters. So when they take something that matters like that and they put on the flag or the insignia of the Soviet Union, that's CCCP, which is the Cyrillic script acronym of the Soviet Union, boy, that's a problem. Now, I realize that's a bit of discourse analysis, but it's not a bit of discourse analysis in terms of deconstruction. I'm just observing that Putin is very, very careful of symbolism. I know what that symbol means. I know that hockey is very, very important to Putin. I know that Putin has said in many interviews that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical mistake that was ever made. I am not on unfirm ground to say watch out. I said that in December. Here we are in February and there's a war. So I did another thread. And I said I'm not an expert on Putin. I am pulling from people much smarter than I am. But I gave an explanation of what Putin was doing. I gave an explanation, a brief explanation of who Nikita Khrushchev was, how he attacked the cult of personality, why the political arm of the Soviet Union, which was held in the Politburo, and the security agency, which was their KGB, was kept separate, and why they always said that the head of the KGB should never become the head of the Politburo because that would be mixing those two units, and if one person had all that power, they'd get another Stalin, which they didn't want. Nobody wanted one man to have that much power. And then how Yuri Andropov very quickly, because that speech, I mean, he gave his cult of personality speech, I think in 64 or 66, Khrushchev did. And by the time Yuri Andropov rolls around in 82, he's, the former head of the KGB becoming the head of the Politburo. Putin was a KGB agent in 1975, so he's watching all this. He wants the Soviet Union to come back, and not for maybe ideological reasons, but for KGB ideological reasons, right? He wants the power and the prestige of Russia. Now, I'm not getting that from my own expertise. Read Winter is Coming by Garry Kasparov. Kasparov talks about Putin's ideology, how Putin views the world. If you talk to, and a lot of the people here won't like him, but I still think he knows his stuff in his area, Tom Nichols talking about Putin on Russia, how Putin is a KGB thug, right? That Putin really does want the Soviet Union, but not for ideological reasons, but for Putin reasons. That's what he's after. So I want to just be really careful about this. I don't want to move and say, well, as it turns out, I'm somewhat of a Russia expert myself. No, but the guy who trained me in politics when I was growing into it predicted before it happened that Yuri Andropov would become the head of the KGB, and he explained to me on the basis of which he made that prediction. So I'm passing along the information coming from other people, okay? What I don't do is try and become anyone's one-stop shop for Putin information, one-stop shop for Ukraine updates, one-stop shop for policy analysis. No, 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 no. I have one thing that I can explain and explain really well. One is how their hockey system functions within their nationalism, which I have a pretty good idea about. And two, how Putin operates, broadly speaking. But that's all coming from people who actually are experts like Tom Nichols and Gary Kasparov. But there's a certain segment of people that aren't doing that. There's a certain segment of people whose prestige, their reputation, the way that they make a living, their social persona, their social relevance came from COVID-19 updates. And now they've jumped over and said, well, now I've got to start talking about Ukraine. And I can go from health to biosecurity, and then from biosecurity just to security. And that's made possible because we're just living in a world of discourse. And if they can sound technical enough and sound
ride the
enough,
ideological bandwidth
that's right,
is based on this agreement or this association.
Yeah, the people who are already following them for COVID updates just end up following them now for Ukraine updates, and they can get something of a reputation, even when they're wrong about everything. Like, I will say this about myself. I have said very little about Russia and Putin. I've done 2 threads on it. I did one back in December talking about how it's time to start watching Putin very, very, very closely right now. Maybe don't panic, but start watching really closely back in December because he's going to start doing stuff, and we might want to pay attention to what he was doing. And boy, that prediction worked out really well. And then I did another thread talking about him from his KGB work, and I will put that analysis up against anyone because I didn't come up with that myself. That I'm getting from people like Gary Kasparov and Tom Nichols. Mm-hmm. Okay? I will gladly have anyone test my threads against reality. Gladly. And I try to stay away from things where I genuinely don't know, which is why I haven't jumped in on the Ukraine-Russia thing, right? I support the Ukrainians. Sweet, sweet mother of all that's good and holy. I really hope that they can repel the Russian invasion, or at least stop it. But I don't know that how much I'm willing to dive in and start saying, hey, let's get a kinetic war, on the ground fight with Russia, who's a nuclear power. I don't know how much I'm willing to do that. I don't know enough about Putin's current thinking as of today in terms of his military strategy to know whether or not he'd use nuclear weapons. I can tell you that his overarching view is that he wants to have something like the Soviet Union and bring Russia back to the kind of prominence it had during the Cold War, where nobody made a move geopolitically without thinking, what will the Soviet Union do, because they had that kind of power and influence. I'm pretty sure Putin wants that. But in terms of his military tactics, I don't know. I'm completely out of my depth on that. And so, again, I would say to people, like, I would very gently and very quietly to myself say, not sure how willing I am to have a no-fly zone when there's the possibility of a nuclear war. Gary Kasparov sees it one way. Tom Nichols sees it a different way. I don't think that I have the expertise or level of knowledge on that to adjudicate between those two guys and say who's going to be right. So I'm not going to say who I think is going to be right. I'm not going to say where I stand on that.
Side note, whatever's in your hand with the flapping is getting into the recording.
Oh.
The clapping.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The clicking. Yeah.
Oh, that's a fidget. I think I was fidgeting with, and there's a magnet that pulls it shut.
You should get a poppet. The kids have these poppets now. Anyways.
Oh.
So your stance in this realm of discourse, you've carved out, like we began, you've carved out a significant platform speaking to certain issues or in a certain way about certain things. And that is a broad enough wheelhouse that you can spin quite a few plates. You can move around because you're talking basically about discourse and how things happen. That's kind of my bower too. I'm in the meta, which makes me able to talk about the way in which certain issues are occurring within discourse without actually
That's
saying anything about how things should operate in the real world. Now, I do over time form opinions, such as with, I kind of have a groundwork knowledge of certain types of feminism and certain types of gender ideology and certain types of religious understandings and certain things. I have a belief that I'll put out there, but by and large, I have a very, very small niche, and I don't move around. I could move around, and I would get a lot more views and just attention revenue if I followed the topics of the day. And I should do that. And I have to do that. Right? I have to do that. I have to be relevant. I have to maintain relevance, but there's a certain cost-benefit analysis, or there's a certain sort of integrity or humility that I can have where I can play this discourse game without being subject to the tides of it, and without getting bigger in the head than I already am.
Yes, this is the correct opinion to have. The correct way to think about this is to say, within the areas in which I have deep knowledge and understanding, there's a lot to mine there. The places where my deep knowledge splashes into other things, I might want to comment on the way in which the thing I understand splashes onto other things. But that doesn't then make me an expert on those other things. So my understanding of how discourses function, and my understanding from my political time of what was thought of Putin by the people who were much smarter than I am in that area, and who were working in politics, who trained me, I was able to put those two things together and say, we should be watching Putin. And then I was able to put together a couple of threads that said, this is how Putin operates, and this is his broader overarching worldview. I can't go any further than that, and I need to stop. Okay? However, when you're not trying to be an expert, when you're not trying to say something valuable, when you're trying to go with the herd, you don't need to do that. All you need to do is drop the needle out of your emoji and put in the sunflower or put in the Ukraine logo, and that's it. That's all you need to do. And all of the downstream effects, like when Adam Kinzinger is talking about a no-fly zone, we need to have a no-fly zone. He called an MMA fighter cowardly for not wanting to, said that a fighter said, like, I'll fight on the ground in Arkansas for anyone, against anyone who comes against me. And Kinzinger's like, I can't believe this coward. Our guys in World War II would have had a thing about this, and they'd have showed him who's boss. And I'm sitting here, I'm just like, dude, you are an elected official. This MMA fighter is making the point that he will gladly fight for his country, but he doesn't think it's wise to go fighting in Ukraine. That's a very different thing from Adolf Hitler, when what Hitler was doing. By the time the Americans got into World War II, I mean, Germany had opened up a war on, two fronts? And Japan had done Pearl Harbor? That's a very different scenario, and a very different adversary with a very different
army.
And to
boot, it was not known what Hitler was actually doing, specifically with the Jews and the Gypsies and etc.
Right, and so you look at this, and again, I'm not a World War II expert, but I did take a history class. I mean, we are taught about this, and I'm aware enough of history to know of the basic history that we are taught in high school and in my college history classes to know that what we are dealing with Adolf Hitler is not Vladimir Putin. There are some similarities in terms of authoritarianism, but these men are different, and these situations are very, very different. Adolf Hitler did not have 6,000 nuclear weapons. It is a different story, and there must be a very, very, very different analysis and response. He's a sitting congressman or a House member or whatever it is. We need to be careful about this.
If you go on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, Lindsey Graham was making some pretty idiotic things about trying to get assassination attempts happening or whatever.
Right,
you know, like.
and I mean, and those guys are both Republicans, right? So we're not even picking on just woke people here. We're just like, it's silly the way things have gone on. I mean, someone who everyone hates, but I thought has actually done very well here in keeping his cool and asking questions and not overstepping his bounds, is Marco Rubio. I don't think he said anything bombastic or outlandish. I don't think Joe Manchin has said anything bombastic or outlandish. Let's pick a good Democrat. I don't think Tim Kaine has said anything outlandish or bombastic. It's so this is the world that we're living in, where it's utterly discursive, and nobody's asking, like, what are the consequences of this going to be? How confident are you that you really, really know how Putin's going to respond to you imposing a no-fly zone? How confident are you that... Now, I understand Gary Kasparov, and I understand the view that he's put forth, and I understand Tom Nichols and the view that he's put forth, and they have different views, and I am not sure which of those is entirely correct, but both of those men have been much more measured and careful in their comments than Adam Kinzinger or Lindsey Graham were. And I would add that both Nichols and Gary Kasparov have a very, very good track record on this. I don't know about, like, I mean, I am annoyed with Tom's expertise stuff as well. Sometimes he bugs me. But in terms of understanding Putinism in Russia, I mean, this is his area of expertise, and he has a very, very strong track record. He was working on national policy, and he was working in the Reagan administration on this exact thing when the Soviets were still, it was thought at the time, very, very powerful. And he has a very good track record of understanding what Putin is going to do. Gary Kasparov's book, Winter is Coming, might as well read as a history. He could just change the future tense verbs to past tense verbs and then release it as a history, because he got so much right in that book. He has a very, very good track record. I don't know that Kinzinger has that kind of track record. I don't know that Graham has that kind of track record. And here's the thing. I don't know that any of the newly minted Ukraine experts have that sort of a track record. I know that the track record of the COVID people is bad, and it gets worse with every... The only thing it looks like they got right was when they said, hey, the vaccine will lower severe illness rates. Okay, they got that right. Masks, cloth masks, wrong. Efficacy of masks in schools, more and more and more looking like it's wrong. Efficacy of lockdowns looks like drastically overstated. Impact
and they don't pay the cost.
Impact on childhood verbal skills seems to have been way larger than they thought. Impact on learning generally, impact on speech pathology. So it looks like they got a lot wrong. So, I mean, you can almost understand them wanting to get away from COVID because they got that completely wrong. But why are we listening to them now? Why are we taking Eric Feigelding seriously with respect to anything about the Ukraine or Russia at all when he got so much wrong about the pandemic? I mean, he was a nonstop panic factory for 2 years. I mean, he's like the guy who predicts that the Yankees are going to win the World Series every year, and then when the Yankees win the World Series, he claims to have predicted it. So, yeah, I mean, when you make as many predictions as he did, you're bound to have enough right. Let's look at the ones that were wrong, and let's be careful about that. So, but this is all enabled by the fact that we're living in a world of discourse. And so if the discourse looks good and it looks predictable and it looks correct and it looks right and it sounds right and it fits in with the dominant discourses and the other dominant motifs of the era, people are willing to go along with it, even when that allows banks to engage in debanking practices, even when it allows for the creation of a sort of financial system which we might not want. Maybe we don't want our systems enmeshed this way. Did the financial crisis of 2008 teach us nothing about keeping some of these institutions separate from each other and not completely interdependent and interconnected? And has nobody thought about this? Do we not remember what rampant speculation and quick moves did during 2008? Did we not remember what a lack of oversight did in 2008? I mean, the libertarians got that wrong. Banking needs more oversight, not less. These things need to be heavily regulated. And these things also, not in addition to being regulated, we need to have such things as regulation with respect to debanking, so that they can't exercise that kind of authority. I mean, this is stuff that needs to happen. Have we not learned our lesson here? Have we forgotten this? Have we forgotten that the discourse has real world consequences? Have we forgotten that first comes the word, but then comes the world, and the imagination needs to fit into the word and the world, that the discourse of imagination needs to be held in check by the principles of rationality that govern reality, and the principles and the laws of nature which govern the physical world, and then we can start imagining. But we got to remember those two things first. We have forgotten this, and it's leaving us desperately at sea. And so now we have this situation where all of these companies are being dragged into fights that they're not qualified to comment on, and they're being dragged into discourses about which they know nothing, and they're expected to comment on ways because the employees would like them to comment. But the employees are not qualified to do that. Hey, at least I predicted, on based on what my little knowledge was, that Russia needed to be watched. But I wouldn't consider myself qualified to say, here's how we should handle it. And I don't think expertise, by the way, comes from credentialism. So anyone who wants to say, but Wokal Distance, you talk about theology and you've never once mentioned Megan DeFranza, or you haven't mentioned Douglas Otati or John R. Frankie. Please.
Wokal.
I don't need to be.
Can I tell you something about your brain?
Now you're just name dropping. Why are you doing that?
No, can I
it's
tell
not
you
name
something?
dropping. I'm only quoting people I've read. The point is that credentialism and expertise are not the same thing.
Yeah.
And just because we recognize that difference doesn't mean that expertise belongs to anyone with an internet connection and an ability to Google.
Well, it's relevance mongering in a way, right? People are. Well, it starts with the phenomena of this prophilicity or this image-based affiliation or affirmation of a cause rather than an understanding or a propositional expertise or a propositional perspective on a cause that would then have results that you would then have to take responsibility for. You can just say gay,
Yeah.
not read the bill that you're saying is saying something that it's not saying, so you have to say it, and you don't have to think very carefully about what is implied by teaching kindergartners and first graders and second graders and third graders sexuality. That's sexual courses or sexuality courses that are based in an ideology that puts ideas in their heads that leads to real world negative consequences, to grooming, to a relationship to their own bodies that is not sacrosanct. If you want to go there, is much easier to manipulate by adults and by online world, right? You don't have to think about that. You can just say gay. So on that level, you have people just going with the narrative. And then the people who rise to prominence within that, they just relevance monger. They have a preternatural talent for saying whatever needs to be said. They cogently make rationalizations after the fact for whatever it is that the mob or the narrative dictates.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's social entrepreneurship. It's social media entrepreneurship. They're just expanding their territory on commenting about things, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, someone's going to say, people do the same thing to me. Well, you don't have a PhD in postmodernism. Okay, but I've done the reading. I can go through grammatology with you. If you want to talk about Derrida's paper machine or Spectres of Marx, we can have that conversation if you really want. Well, when you talked about, what meaning is, you didn't clearly define what an illocutionary act was. Oh, shut up. This is not how any of this works. I get annoyed when people think that expertise can be reduced to the on-the-spot recitation of technicalities in a way which sounds intelligent. That isn't what expertise is. There's a deep level of understanding that has to occur, and a deep ability to know the truth of the situation, to understand what is going on, to have real insight into the phenomena and the reality that is in play. And when you have people who have built their platforms around COVID because they were a doctor or they were a researcher or whatever it was, and now that COVID is over, in order for them to matter, they've got to now pivot to something else.
Yeah.
They're trying to bootstrap. They're trying to maintain the relevance of their platform because they don't want it to. I mean, how many people were quote breakout stars of the pandemic? How many people's social relevance depends on that, or on a pandemic, or that's the thing they know about, and now they want to use that thing that they know about to get into some other realm.
Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can do that with integrity, and then you can spot and call out people who do that without integrity.
Yeah, like if there's something else that you know about, and maybe you I don't know. I'm a guitar player. Maybe in the 30 years when wokeness is done, I'll be playing guitar on my channel. Yeah. But by then I'll have been playing guitar for 50 years, and I might reasonably be expert enough to have something to say about it. Yeah. I just think, and maybe we're coming to the end of this conversation here a little bit, so maybe I'll throw this out. I have a deep antipathy towards people who have confused, on the one hand, Googling for expertise, and also people who think, on the other hand, that credentialism is expertise. And who, on the basis of the fact that somebody is unpolished, perhaps, in their speaking about something, or is unpolished in their presentation, that they therefore don't know what they're talking about. This is all the surface level stuff that's unimportant. I, for one, couldn't care less about whether or not Gary Kasparov can give an impressive sounding presentation. His track record is good. His track record is right.
Oh, so this is what you're doing. You're just trying to explain your constant typos because you have fat thumbs and you type those threads and you're like, listen, don't judge me for.
When I come on your channel, you'll see a lot of me going, thinking about, it doesn't sound like a TED Talk. I don't sound like a smooth, prepared philosopher saying, well, as we consult John Searle's book Intentionality, we have to remember that this is coming through a Fregean lens. As Frege came out and he talked about sense and reference, and then how that moves into the logical positivist milieu, and is commented on by Carnap.
Well, we know you can go there if you need to.
And talks about Donald Davidson and Willard Van Orman Quine, who knocked out, in the Two Dogmas of Empiricism, knocked out logical positivism, and then that comes in through Kripke's causal theory, and also Hilary Putnam was there at that. Yeah, okay, great. I didn't do that, and I didn't get a lot of details right and technical. No. I'm trying to explain an idea to an audience, and that's going to lead through hitches and glitches and starts and stutters and stops so people can get it, because I'm maximizing for pedagogy.
Yeah. And you still need a fidget toy in your hand. That's just part of the deal.
Yeah. And it's a call. There's a when I believe it's the prophet Samuel shows up in David's town to anoint King David. And so David's the one who killed Goliath. If everyone knows the story of David and Goliath, before David killed Goliath, he got anointed by the prophet Samuel. And what happens is Samuel comes to the town where David is, and he calls out David and his brothers. And I think David had 11 brothers or something like this. And Samuel lines all the brothers up, and he sees the tallest brother. And David wasn't actually there. They didn't call David in. David was out watching, I think he was watching the sheep at the time. And so Samuel the prophet showed up and said, get all the brothers who are here. So all the brothers who were there, I think there's 10 of them or 11 of them, all got lined up, and David wasn't there. He was out tending sheep. And Samuel is going to anoint one of them. And he goes over to the tallest brother, who's tall, the oldest, he was the tallest, he was the best looking, he was in the army, and he reaches out his hands to anoint him, and in the story, God says to him, "Stop, for man looks at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart." And so Samuel goes, "Well, who should I anoint?" And they find out none of them. So he calls King David in, who was again out as a shepherd, and he wasn't King David at the time; he was just David. And so after Samuel talks to each brother, he says none of them. So they call David in, and David runs in. He runs in and says, "Yeah, what's up?" And Samuel picks him, the youngest of the brothers, who has at that time the least going for him. The idea there, I love how Eugene Peterson translates that in The Message, where he says, "Stop focusing on outward appearances and make a right judgment." There is a severe lack on the part of people to be able to make a right judgment.
Even more so in the world of pure discourse and imagination.
Where when you are flooded with discourse constantly and consistently, and there's more discourse than you could ever completely vet carefully, people have a real hard time. We haven't yet figured out how to crowdsource this much discourse in a way that's effective. And there's an awful lot of people that are making their judgments about who to listen to or who not to listen to, not on the basis of whether that person has genuine expertise in the field, but whether or not that person has a sufficient number of mask emojis. People who are hopping on the trans bandwagon because they think, well, they've bought the branding, and they haven't yet figured out that there are detransitioners who are saying, "Hey, look, I showed up at a clinic, was given a 1-hour consultation with somebody who had 2 weeks of training, and then I was given testosterone. And then I had gender reaffirmation surgery. And now I can't have children. And I realized I'm not trans." And anyone who erects even the slightest bit of gatekeeping, "You're saying don't say gay." You don't need to have a conversation about gender at all with any child who's not under the age of 8. You don't. And by the way, teacher, you're not qualified. Because if there's one thing that teachers are definitely not qualified to talk about, it's the psychology of gender, because they are not trained in this at all. That's a very, very young field, and none of them are experts in it. You don't need to be cracking anyone's psychology open. You don't need to be jumping on the bandwagon because I know you watched a bunch of YouTube videos and you went to a colloquium, you went to a gender training thing, and now you want to be an activist, and so you're going to err on the side of affirmation in all cases. You don't need to be discussing these gender theories with kids. You're not qualified for that. And second, most of your gender theories are completely bonkers. So even if you were qualified, you wouldn't be teaching the stuff that's being thrown out. Because you'd realize that it's being thrown out because it's quackery. And that you need to stop. And as Jordan Peterson says, the lawsuits in 15 years will take care of a lot of this. But the question is, what do we do until then? And the question is, how many of the people who are pushing this stuff are going to be allowed to fail upward to their next gig? Mm-hmm. In the same way that we had the COVID to Ukraine discourse pipeline, will there be a transgender to engineering discourse pipeline? Will there be a trans to psychology pipeline? Will it be a trans to race pipeline? What pipeline will that be? When the woke fever breaks, what will all the people who are writing about race and make their bones writing about race, when they switch, what will they switch to? What will their influence be based on then?
Silence. Maybe they'll shut up.
Oh, no.
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 You can't do that in discourse. That's death. That's immolation.
Yeah, silence is death, because what are you not doing? You're not part of the discourse.
Yeah.
Your relevance has come by being part of the discourse. This is why they focus so much on citing. This is why when Beth Allison Barr gave an interview to Time magazine and didn't mention anyone. She didn't really mention anybody else. She was just asked about her work and commented on it. And then Candace Bino came out and says, Beth Allison Barr spent her entire interview pretending women of color don't exist. It's a ridiculous interpretation. What does Beth Allison Barr do? Immediately bend the knee. Oh, I'm so sorry. I need to take a few days to think about myself, so I'll be hopping off social media for a while I recollect my mental health, blah, 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 blah. Then, when Candace Bino shows up a picture of her billboard in New York Times, where's Beth Allison Barr dutifully retweeting it and saying, yay, wonderful. Because we all have to make other people begin to exist. We have to create their social persona by bringing them into the discourse and mentioning their work, which is why we have to cite this scholar and cite this scholar and cite this scholar. Why? Because if you don't cite them, they don't exist. We have to reify their social position in the discourse by continually bringing them up. Even if their work didn't actually matter, even if it wasn't groundbreaking, even if it wasn't necessarily good, you're committing a sort of discursive genocide by not bringing them up. Or you didn't cite enough Asians, you didn't cite enough Jews, you didn't cite enough black people, you didn't cite enough white people. It's discrimination. So we have to hand out the citations as though they are
representation is actualization.
Yes, representational sustenance.
Yeah.
You know? And it's just like, this needs to stop.
Well,
people are too, they don't know how to live a life that isn't measured by social media. They don't have the capability when someone says, your life sounds boring, of saying, okay, then don't participate. I feel like they have to up their game. Privacy is a superpower. This is something I have learned. Privacy is absolutely a superpower. What do you know about my life? I mean, regular followers of this channel will know a little bit about it.
Yeah.
But I keep that quiet because my life, my real everyday existence, isn't determined by the likes and the comments on this video, although I appreciate them. And it's wonderful to have people who will appreciate my work and
marginally retweet your
You know, I enjoy going. I enjoy having marginal retweets on Twitter, but my life, my real way of going about my existence in the world, isn't determined by that.
Mm-hmm.
And
speaking of which, I have to get to my life.
Do you? Okay.
Yeah, I have some life that I have to live.
I'm gonna try and figure out what happened. I wonder if this is a function of because I have an HD camera, it's projecting a lot more, and whether or not.
Before we do the technical stuff, which people don't need to listen to, why don't you guys say goodbye? Thank you, Wokal, for another visitation, and I think this is going to leave people hungry for more, so we will schedule another talk in a few weeks.
Yeah. I would like to do that, and I'd like to sit down with James again and chat.
Yeah,
because I think there's some fruit on that tree that can be picked again. We've been apart too long.
Yes.
So if you want to do that, I would like to sit down with him and we could do like a live stream or some such thing like this.
Yes, always a hit.
Always a hit, and we'll discuss how we are going to go from this space to being experts in Ukraine. It's been
James
wonderful.
will just say
Thank you.
Ukraine didn't happen.
That's the Baudrillardian analysis, which is what we're qualified to discuss. Okay. Wokal_distance on Twitter, and thank you for having me, sir.
Absolutely.